The first reading is fairly ancient. It contains an early expression of faith. What has come down to us under the term of kerygma, which is the noun that comes from kerisein, which means to proclaim as a herald, to preach. It was what went around the Mediterranean basin in the first generation after Calvary. The wow feeling, he is risen. It's all there turning on the resurrection. And these were men who had been there, and names are given. There is one that we might pass over without actually taking notice of. One name, as well as Cephas, which, by the way, in brackets, is a good evidence of the primacy of Peter as already understood in the first generation. For the fact is that Cephas was the name that they called him by in the apostolic band, Kephas, rock, indicating that the Lord had put that name there. Amongst themselves, they also tended at certain times to use the old word Simeon or Simon. We find it in the scriptures. But the fact that the name was changed to that right from the beginning indicates that the Lord actually did mean something by that name. And the whole ethos of the primacy of Peter is there, say what you like, from the earliest times. And without Peter, the structure cannot be complete. Remember that when talking to our evangelical brethren. Sola Scriptura means precisely that, and we have scriptures on our side. But the name that comes up as well as the global assembly of brethren, by the way, the fact that they have fallen asleep comes down to us as well. You know how, don't you? In our expression, cemetery. Koimeterion is the place where people are sleeping. It's an expression of the early faith of the church. To rest one's head and go to sleep is to be in that position of resting. And Koimeterion, cemetery, is the resting place, the sleeping place, awaiting the last day. Now, the name is James. We might pass over it, because there are no references in the scriptures themselves to this apparition, to this appearance to James. But, and this is my own intuition, take it for what it's worth, I have a feeling that this actually is quite an important encounter with James, the first of the apostles to shed his blood for Christ, as early as 42 or 44. Now, what may have happened, I have a feeling, is this. The Lord did appear to this apostle, who was a cousin of his, and therefore in his family circle. But I think that he may have given him a special message. And it may have been this. James, you're going to be my successor in this part, where it'll all start, Jerusalem. And I am giving you, and to you personally, a special gift, which will be handed on to all your descendants in this place. I have a feeling that when he appeared to James, something else happened. Not in the scriptures, but it's sort of there in oral tradition. He would have given him something big in what I just referred to, the wow feeling that he's around. And that is still there, only in the hands of the successor of James. You know what I mean, don't you? The miracle of Holy Saturday. Only in his hands does it happen. Same time, same channel since the early church. The heavenly fire. James's descendant, the Patriarch of Jerusalem, has this miracle, and only him, once a year. Going into the place where the Lord rose and perhaps where he appeared to James, it happens again. The fire from heaven comes and lights his candle. And from there is lit the candle of the others in church and also of the patriarchates throughout the world, because it's taken from there by midnight afterwards. That, I think, is the significance of this strange appearance to James. Bear that in mind when it comes to next Easter. The Gospel, just before we came in, we had 6 baptisms here in this sanctuary. And Father Michael would have used this word, Ephetha. The senses are unplugged. It's the passive of pathach, to open, be opened. Now I just want for a second to dwell on this opening. One time in 1986, and this is after 10 years of complete enclosure and hardly speaking at all, remember, that had an effect. One was completely enclosed on the interior, and it has a psychological effect in making one extremely nervous about facing people. That was what I was coming from at that time, and it was perceived by people. One was not used to talking, and one hadn't, for instance, talked to a woman for 10 years. That's not indifferent either in growing up. Therefore, a huge, almost painful shyness comes out. One day, we were in a huge convention in Aachen. Most of us were young, but about 7,000 of us, and about another 7,000 the following week. And one night, we were in prayer, and things were happening. And words were coming through. This is fully charismatic, but fully liturgical and fully orthodox. In fact, a bishop would always celebrate at the High Mass in the morning. And things were coming through, what they call words of knowledge. And one came, and it was this. There's somebody here whose impediment of speech is being loosed. And at the end of the night, or the following day, somebody was sleeping in the same tent as me, I forget his name now, a good Englishman, he was actually a student. He said to me, that was meant for you. Because I couldn't actually, without nervousness, and it was obvious, speak properly at that stage. And bit by bit, from then it was healed. And there's no trace of it left. But it wasn't evident. That's opening up with regard to the output. Because one has to speak without being misunderstood or unclear. It's like what St. Paul talks about, giving the signal in some kind of bugle and not being understood by those who want to know the warning. One has to be speaking clearly, make sense. Be clear. Good prose is like a window pane. In fact, we had the feast of St. Alphonsus this week, and you know what he said? He was a great popular preacher and a great intellectual. Already at the age of 17, he had a double doctorate, civil law and ecclesiastical law. And he said this, I want to preach, and I will always preach in such a way that the most simple woman in the congregation will understand my every word. Now remember, in the time when he was preaching, that was not always the case. It was kind of understood that a great preacher would be more or less above the heads. He would not be understood. He was so intellectual, and he would want to be brilliant. This other one I also want to attack, but in more detail, because it applies to each of you here. Being opened means clearing all those blockages in your channels of reception which impede input, because we are a machine of output and input. A telephone has input and output. Classically, it's that end and that end. A wireless, a radio, has output only. Many human beings are wirelesses, not telephones. You are talking to them, and all these channels of profound input are completely blocked up. One starts to answer a point, and they're already interrupting you. I remember hearing this from a student years ago. She said something like this, and she was very polite in everything, in all her conversations, and she just came out with this off the cuff. I don't like, and she wasn't referring to me, but just in general, I don't like to have my words interrupted. She talked bit by bit, little by little, said little, but said well all that she said. And she did not like those bits to be jettisoned in the air through somebody breaking into the sentence. It's actually in the scriptures, in one of the sapiential writings, something like the Proverbs, or maybe Ecclesiasticus. There's a word there about not breaking the word that is interrupting the words of someone you're talking to. Cultivate that. It's basic human courtesy, and it's the first step in unblocking the channels of input. Now, profound input is only going to happen if at the moment of reception one is completely what? Calm. Like the waters of the sea. No ripples. Now, classically, those ripples will be, if you're not careful, and look at yourself, these. Someone is talking to me, and at this point, I'm starting to prepare the answer to that point. And at that point, what's going on? He's not yet finished, and there's new truths coming in. I'm completely blocking it out. I'm focusing in on this point, and already my attention is going into answering. And the point is this: I will actually get to that point, I will answer that point, even if necessary, straight away. Now that's how conversation is actually going on right over the planet. Very few abdicate and let someone else have that throne, allowing the person to express all that was in the back of their mind. I remember actually often in chapter, I shouldn't be telling you this, but it helps you understand the point. This was always the problem in chapter, I found, in the monastic life. It was this problem of attacking the first point, and the person who might have prepared his thing, which might have been quite important for the community, was never really allowed to get to the whole arguing of his case. Why? He was intercepted at the first point, which was only a preamble. Do you see how dysfunctional that is? One last point. There's another form of blocking input, and I'm going to a different dimension. It's the vertical, because it's the same faculty of perception which happens. Basically, the soul in God's presence being in that attitude of abdication and complete stillness. For him to start moving with his voice, which is from the Holy Spirit, intuitions and inspirations and lights. One big thing, and I'll just leave you with enough for today, it's one, but it's a big one. If you handle it, much else will be healed. It's this problem of coming also into that sacred, still space where God wants room and space to reign, with more of this. More of this telling God my problems. More of this thinking out my problems. Because prayer is a privileged time to sort problems out intellectually. All the hours in choir, remember, a lot of them are spent sorting out problems. Now, I just leave you with a story which I hope you remember the point. It's this. This is a subtle form of spiritual activism. There are 3 diseases in the monastic life. One is selfishness, spiritual narcissism, looking at myself. The other is childishness. Childishness, I say. People not growing up. And it happens, unfortunately, often more favourably in a situation where we haven't got a family. People not really getting out of their childhood. The other is this, and it links up with this. It's the disease of activism. Activism. Going through life in buzzing mode. Now you come into your prayer and what's going on? You can't really adore. You are being adored. You are the centre even there. I just deal with this. It happened in the desert in the first centuries. A monk was going into the market but coming back, and he was going from one grotto to the next, and he found one where this was going on. There was a young monk in there. He'd not long been in his cell, installed in his little grotto. He was kind of keen on getting there. And this other monk, was an experienced monk, saw around him something going on which he couldn't see himself. It was this. He was there, and it was time for prayer. And he was getting this thought: I must sort this thing out now, I must get that bit of the cell in order. Yes, and he got his brush and got the cell in order and trimmed things off. That went that way, that time of prayer. The time of prayer came along again, and he was about to settle to it, and he had this thought: oh, that tree is an awful nuisance, it's taking away all the light, I must get rid of that tree. So he started to chop away at the tree. Next time round, it was time for prayer again, and this thought came to him: I haven't made those baskets recently, I must get onto that. So he started to make wicker baskets. And this other monk could see, each time there was a black Ethiopian, that was how the demons were described in those days, inspiring each time in his head something better to do than what he was there for. Does that ring a bell? Something better to do than what he was there for. Translate: what am I doing in my times of prayer? What am I doing when God should be God and only He?